Jeff Dwoskin Show presents Crossing the Streams with host Jeff Dwoskin, Bob Phillips, Ron Lippett, Howard Rosner, Sal D'Amelio, and Zach Wiseman, and today's special guest. Thank you for joining us as we talk about what we are streaming right here on Crossing the Streams.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's a Three Geeks podcast conversation. John, along with Justin. How you doing, Justin?
Well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. And our guest this evening, Mr. Daniel Shulman. Daniel, how you doing?
I am doing fantastic. So far, it's two geeks, right? But we may have
the third's delayed. Yeah.
we might be joined by Jason here. He got some family things. He got kind of tied up a little bit, shall we say?
Although I don't know if you have to be tech savvy to get the geek title, but I could be the third geek temporarily.
You're in. You're in. Yeah, you're in.
You got it. You're in.
You've been knighted. It's all good.
Excellent.
Well, Daniel, you're a very well-known musician, and I want to start off by asking, were you always kind of musically inclined?
According to my mom, yeah. She said that when she was still in the hospital after I was born, she would be listening to music on the radio, and when the song would end and the DJ would start talking, I would start crying. And that once the music came on again, I would stop crying. And she said my dad came to visit, and she told him that, and he said, that's total BS. That's not true at all. And so she turned the radio off, and I immediately started crying, and then she turned the music back on, and I stopped. So according to her, I've always been incredibly drawn to music. It's definitely still true to this day. If I'm not feeling well, music is going to help me calm down. It's going to help me feel better. And so as a musician, but also just as a music fan, I'm incredibly drawn to music. I don't actually know that I had a lot of innate musical talent. Some people do, they just pick up any instrument and they're immediately good at it. I kind of felt like I had to put in the blood, sweat, and tears, but I was just so passionate about it that I was willing to do that because it was just crazy important to me.
So were your parents musically inclined? Did they play music or no?
My dad was an amateur musician.
Okay.
He said that, he wanted to be a jazz trumpet player and that his parents told him that he could be anything he wanted to be as long as he was a doctor or lawyer. And so he kind of told, me the story about how, let's see if I remember this correctly. The second president of the United States, John Adams, said, my dad was a lawyer, so I could be president, so my son could be a poet. And my dad said, well, I guess, my dad was a lawyer, so I could be a doctor, so you could be a musician.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Has it always been the guitar in terms of your music?
My main instrument is bass, but I do also play guitar.
Oh, forgive me. Yeah, I meant bass.
That's all right. The first thing, my parents got me a toy drum kit, I think when I was about 3, and I loved it, and I would just bash around on that. And then at one point, because I was playing it all the time, I think my mom did this on purpose, but she said, how would you like to get real drums? I said, absolutely. And so she got me just a snare drum. And I was like, wait a minute, I went from the full kit to just a snare drum? I don't care whether it's real or not. This sucks. And so, although I can play a little bit of drums, that was kind of the end of my drum career. But then I took like classical piano lessons, and kind of me and all my brothers got those lessons, and they dropped out, and I kept going and would do recitals and stuff like that. And that was cool until I discovered pop radio and rock and roll. And then I wanted to play guitar and bass, and I could play piano a little bit, but it kind of fell by the wayside.
So what was that band? What was that song that really got you hooked then? Do you remember? Do you remember that, like that hook?
Well, I think the first thing, my first favorite song was Back Jack Do It Again by Steely Dan. At first, I would just listen to this station in LA called KHJ. It was a pop station on AM radio, and I just liked anything that they played. All the songs. I'd like been into my parents' classical and jazz music, and then one day I was driving with my friend in the car with his parents, and they were playing these pop songs, and like everyone was singing along. And I was like, "Whoa, that's cool! I got to start checking out these other types of music and other stations." And so, yeah, I just liked everything that came on. I think my first favorite artist was Elton John.
Okay.
Nice.
And I felt lucky, when I eventually started touring, that he invited us over to his house once, and I got to hang out with him one day, which was super
That'd be incredible. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, that's impressive. That's amazing.
Yeah, I was playing with Garbage, and we were playing in Nice, France, and he has a house there, and he was there, and Shirley had done something for his charity, and so he invited us all over for lunch, and we ended up spending the whole day there, which, completely blew my mind. I actually just recently stumbled upon the photos again, and so I was excited about that, just to reminisce about that day, because that was definitely a huge day for me.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. You mentioned about the piano, where you said, you could still probably do it, but you haven't practiced in a while. So for somebody, I have no musical ability whatsoever. I'll just throw that out there, Daniel. None. Okay. How many hours did you practice to get your skills for the bass and for guitar? How many hours did you put in, say, in a week?
It really varied. When I was I would say in high school, I was probably putting in about by myself, like maybe 2 hours a day on average, sometimes more, maybe sometimes less, but usually about a couple hours a day. But then I would also rehearse with my band at least 3 times a week and sometimes daily. And so I definitely did a lot of practicing, but I did more playing than I did practicing. I would jam with people. I would rehearse with bands. I'd be rehearsing with more than one band. I'd play in bands at school. So I was just playing a lot.
So was there a lot of, like, I don't want to say sheet music, but was it or just off the cuff, just kind of whatever felt right at the time in terms of playing? You know what I mean?
Well, when I first started playing piano, it was sheet music and reading music. And to be honest, I never got great at sight reading. Sure. I have a pretty good memory not for most things, but for music, it's pretty good. And so, yes, I could learn the music through the sheet music, but mostly I would memorize it.
Sure.
Okay.
And so, I think my reading skills lacked a little bit because I would just memorize stuff instead of actually reading it. But then, once I started playing with rock bands, there really was no sheet music. I did also play jazz. And so that's not like sheet music, like classical music where it's note for note, but there's melodies that are written out and chord charts, and then you just improvise over that. But with all the rock stuff, I never wrote anything down. It's just like, hey, check this out. This is how it goes. And, just sharing creative ideas and figuring it out.
That's awesome. Yeah.
You see, that was one thing I'm fascinated by, Daniel, is like when you are sitting in with a band, whether it was, Meredith Brooks or it was Garbage or Run DMC or whatever, how do you put together, how do you figure out a song? How do you put the pieces together? Because to me, it seems like it's very unstructured. I don't know, but that's just to me, maybe in my ignorance, that's how I feel. Like you're just sitting around and you start playing things, or is that just how they do it in the Hollywood movies?
It really depends on the situation. There's every probably approach that you can imagine. But like, for instance, when I got in the studio with Run DMC, the thing that got me in the studio was I made some demos of rock tracks that they liked. Because I met them and they were like, oh, you're a rock musician. And they were, incorporating rock music into the rap that they were doing. So they were like, you should write something for us. I was like, all right. So I was in college at the time and I had a friend who had a studio. So I started making demos and sending it to them, and they really liked it. So they brought me in to do that. But when I played stuff like that they had written, they would just like sing a riff. Run would like sing a riff, and then I would just figure out what he was getting at. And then as we worked together more in the future, we would sort of collaborate where he'd sing something and then I'd add something to that, and then they would like it, and we would just sort of do it that way. Then with Garbage, the majority of the time, by the time I played on something, they'd already written the song and recorded it. And some of the stuff, they'd have like a keyboard bass part, and I would just learn it by ear from that. And they'd usually give me something ahead of time before I came in the studio, although sometimes not. Sometimes I just go in cold. And then sometimes they just have a basic idea of what was going on, and then I would just come up with a bass line that worked with whatever else they were doing.
Do you have a preference in terms of if I was making a band and it's like, let's create music, what would your preference in terms of creation of that music? What would that be?
My preference is I love co-writing stuff.
Sure.
I love having creative input, and I've written a bunch of stuff on my own, but I prefer to do it in collaboration with someone else. Honestly, the most enjoyable times doing music with me have been in rehearsal rooms, not really at concerts.
Sure.
I like playing concerts, but there's so much going on that's distracting. And, it's like, you're trying to put on a performance and there's tons of people and it's exciting and that's cool. But there's something about taking all of like the whole audience thing away where it's just the musicians together, particularly, yes, if you're creatively working on something and it sounds terrible and you're struggling and you don't know what you're going to do. And then suddenly you hit that mark where it all makes sense and it kind of takes off. And that's kind of a feeling that's hard to get anywhere else, at least for me.
So that brings up an interesting question. How do you know a song's done? I've never really talked to anybody about this. Like, how do you know, like, okay, we're done tweaking? You know what I mean?
It's funny. I'm sure it's different for different musicians. For a band like Garbage, an album is never finished. It's like abandoned. Like if Shirley wasn't in the band, they would still be working on the first record now, like 20 years later. Because those guys are super like meticulous and they want to just keep reworking stuff and making it better and adding in something and subtracting something and remixing it. And so like, they'll keep working on something and finally Shirley will just say, that's it. We're done. We're putting that out, and it's interesting because I remember this one, there was a elementary school teacher who taught second grade. And there was these kids who had amazing paintings. Like everyone was like, how come this teacher's paintings are so much better than all the other second grade paintings? And she was like, I know when to take them away.
Oh.
Because there's a point of diminishing returns, where it's just going to start getting worse from there.
Yeah.
And I do think that can translate probably to music too. You can overthink things. You can, it gets to a point, nothing's ever going to be perfect, right? So it's going to get to a point where if you keep working on it, it's maybe going to get worse instead of better. So it's good enough. The imperfections, are cool. There's this Japanese philosophy and art aesthetic called wabi-sabi, which is the beauty of imperfection. And so like stuff that has cracks and flaws, and instead of fixing it, you kind of highlight them. And I think, a lot of my favorite music, is loose and you can see the cracks and flaws. You can hear the struggle in it, And sometimes I think if it gets too slick, I kind of lose the emotional content of it.
So in the creation process, does fan feedback ever in your mind, does it ever come into it? Is it always just like, hey, I like it, we should do this? You know what I mean? I mean, that's not great how I want to phrase the question, but like, does fan input ever kind of go into that creation process? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think it does, but at least for me personally, I feel when it does, sometimes it doesn't have the best outcome.
Sure.
I kind of feel like when you're doing music that you like and you don't really worry about that, magically other people tend to like it more. If you start thinking about what they're gonna like, that's not necessarily what you do. I mean, I can give you like sort of in a weird way, this is a different story, but it's kind of an example. I'm playing in this band now called the Halloween Jack, right? And it's with Steve Perkins, who's the drummer from Jane's Addiction. And after Jane's Addiction broke up, they were like probably my favorite band at the time. And he invited me to come jam with him and Perry when they were just putting Porno for Pyros together. And they told me about the kind of bass player they were looking for. And I wanted the gig bad. So I tried to be everything that I thought they were looking for. And I didn't end up getting the gig. And then when I heard what Martine was doing in the band, I was like, wow, that's way more like I actually play than what I was trying to do.
Oh, that doesn't feel good. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so like when I went to do the Garbage audition, I was like, you know what, I'm just not even going to care about what I think they're looking for. I'm just going to do what I do. And that was a much better approach.
Sure, that makes sense.
Can we talk about the Garbage audition? How did that come about, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, no, I don't mind at all. It was weird in a way because I had directed a rock video for this indie band at the time. And I went up to San Francisco to have it edited. And I was sitting with the guy who was editing it. And he suddenly goes, hey, you got to check out this video of this other band that I'm editing. And he put on the first Garbage video, which was unfinished. And he was telling me about how like Butch Vig was the drummer, and I was a big fan of Smashing Pumpkins and Nirvana that Butch had produced. So it was interesting to me, and I was excited about it, but I didn't think that much about it. Like a month later, my friend Joe Zimmerman was in this band, and they had a publishing deal at Rondor, and that's where Garbage had their publishing deal, and Garbage's management worked out of those offices, and they just met in the hallway. And she said, oh yeah, Garbage just finished their first album and they're going to go on tour and they're looking for a bass player. So he just called me and said, hey, you should call this lady. And I was like, all right, what the hell? I called her up. She said, bring down a picture, tape, and resume. So I did that. I played, on some rap records like Run DMC records, and I brought those down, and Butch was in the office. And so I met him, and I also brought down some rock stuff that I did. And I hadn't really heard much of their music. So I thought that maybe the rap thing wasn't going to be a good thing. I was like, yeah, this is some of the rap stuff I've done, but I also play rock music. And he was like, no, that's cool. Here's a copy of our record. And when I took it home and heard all the samples and loops and sort of hip hop influence that they were doing, I realized that it was probably an asset, which it was. And so they picked a few guys to come out to Madison, Wisconsin to audition. And it was funny. Their management said, there's some British game show called Bring Your Toothbrush. I never actually got to see it, but it was like you show up to the thing, and if you win, you go on this crazy vacation. So you have to come packed. But if you don't win, you go home. But if you win, you don't get to go home. You just leave straight from there. And so she was like, it's like that. You have to come packed to go on this first tour. But I'm not saying you have the gig. And so I was like, all right. I came packed, and I hung out with them the night before, and as Shirley tells it, I walked into the bar. She took one look at me and said, absolutely not a chance. He's completely the wrong guy. And then I came down, sat down, talked to them for about a minute, and then excused myself to go to the bathroom. And she was like, that's the guy. That has to be the guy.
That has to feel good. Yeah, that feels good.
Which is a good example of what she's like,
Yeah.
Things can go to very extremes, from terrible to great in like 3 seconds, and back the other way. But luckily, it didn't go back the other way, at least at that moment.
So go ahead, Daniel. Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
And then the next day we jammed together. And then they were like, my plane was leaving in like an hour, and they were like, okay, we'll drive you to the airport. And I thought, well, that's it. I didn't get the gig. I brought my toothbrush, but I didn't get to go on vacation. And so I flew home. And by the time I got home, there was a message on my machine saying, hey, we want you to do the tour, come back in a week. And then when I talked to them, they were like, yeah, we thought, you should have a moment to sort of process and get ready and then come back, That
was nice.
And so I came back, we rehearsed for 3 weeks. And then initially they were like, okay, do you want to do a 6-week tour? And I said, sure. And then the album exploded, and we were on tour around the world for a year and a half.
That's
and then
crazy.
I ended up doing the next 2 records and 2 world tours with them. So yeah, at the time I was broke, and I was like, wow, 6 weeks of steady work, incredible. And it ended up being 7 years, which was totally awesome.
Was that your first tour? That was
I had toured before with like indie bands, but that was my first. And actually the first Garbage tour, in my mind was like a major tour because we were in a bus. but we were still playing the same size venues I played in indie bands. The first tour we were playing like 200 seat clubs or whatever,
Yeah.
because the record hadn't taken off yet. So yeah, I mean, once we started playing arenas and bigger places and stuff like that, was my first time doing that for sure. But there was something, kind of exciting about the indie tours that can never quite be matched in a more professional tour. Because like with Garbage, we had, techs, which I love that. I don't like changing strings on the bass. I don't like setting up the amp. So having someone else do that was totally awesome. And, it's great to know where you're going to stay and all that. But there's something very predictable about it. Someone's going to take care of the equipment. People are going to show up to the show. You're going to stay at a hotel. All that sort of set. When I went on the indie tours, I wouldn't want to do it now, but as a young guy, there was something adventurous about. We wouldn't even have any place to stay, and then you just say into the mic, "Hey, will someone in the audience let us stay at your place tonight?" And there's always at least one person who says yes, except the one time when there was only 2 people in the audience, and we just walked up to them afterwards and said, "Can we stay at your place?" And they said no. But if you go to this bar around the corner, there's this woman, Joetta, there, and she will definitely let you stay at her place. And we did, and it was true. She was a musician, and her and her whole band slept in their rehearsal space, and so they let us go over there. And
what a wild
that
life.
was definitely an adventurous spirit to the indie tours. But yeah, that I wouldn't necessarily go back to that, but I'm glad I got a chance to do that too.
See, I was going to ask if there was any wild shenanigans on that first Garbage tour, but it sounds like it was all maybe more structured and whatnot than your indie days.
It was definitely more structured there, but that didn't mean that there was a minimum of shenanigans. There was absolute mayhem at times. At the time, they were a very, very hard drinking band. Okay. And unfortunately, through the process of touring with them, I also learned how to become very hard drinking. Which had it had its fun moments, but it was definitely extremely chaotic and fun, but things get weird when you drink a lot and you don't sleep a lot and you're playing rock music every night. So it definitely got weird, but there were definitely some great moments.
That's awesome.
We kind of have overlooked probably the most obvious question. Some of your influences for your style of playing, who would those be?
As far as bass playing goes?
Sure, yeah.
If you're I have so many friends that you would have never heard of that were huge influences on my playing, but you probably want to know people that you've heard of. So certainly John Entwistle from The Who was a huge influence on me. John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin was a big influence. Gene Simmons from Kiss was a big influence. Paul McCartney, Jaco Pastorius, which is like a jazz fusion player, was incredibly inventive and had a big influence on me. Eric Avery, who played in Jane's Addiction, had an incredibly unique style, and that was a big influence on me. I could probably go on and on. There's a million musicians that I love. Yeah. And, of course, tons that are not bass players that I feel like had a huge influence on me. And, anytime I listen to music now, I feel influenced by anything that I'm hearing.
Okay.
So you worked with Run DMC. What was that like? Just kind of jumping back before Garbage.
It was exciting and terrifying. I was a teenager, and I was in high school, and my friend came over with the first Run DMC album and put on Hard Times, and I'd never heard anything like it before. And we were like all getting excited about it. And then I was going to Boston to check out Berklee School of Music, and they were doing a show there, and I met them at the hotel, and next thing I know, I'm in the limo with them going to their show. And it was like they were rock stars. I didn't know that type of music you could be a rock star, and there were groupies, and it was a packed show, and they were staying at a hotel, and they had limousines, and I was like, this is insane. And then they're like, you're a rock guy, you should write something for us. And I was like, okay. And then so when I actually went into the studio, I was terrified. But and again, I had no idea what was going to happen. I had been in New York when they debuted their second record, which was King of Rock. Mm-hmm. And that was a really exciting moment for me, because when I was in high school, I played in these sort of progressive hard rock bands. And I remember playing at parties where all the girls would be like outside swimming in the pool while we were playing. And there'd be like 3 metalhead dudes like checking us out and getting totally into it. And then like a dancey sort of new wave band would come on and all the girls would come in and dance. And I'd think, God, I'm doing something really wrong. There's something wrong with this picture that's not lining up. And then so when I was in New York and they put on King of Rock at the club, it was like this heavy rock song and everybody was on the floor dancing. And I was like, whoa, I got to get involved with this. I got to do something like that. And then, I got lucky enough actually to go in the studio with them for the 3rd record. And I had no idea it was going to blow up like it did. They did this Walk This Way with Aerosmith and it just went through the roof and suddenly it was absolutely everywhere. And, I didn't really anticipate that, going into the studio with them that day, that it was going to be absolutely everywhere. But, it started a relationship and I came back and did the next record with them. Well, actually the next 2 records, and ended up producing and writing stuff with them. So I just got insanely lucky.
It's awesome.
What, Daniel, if you could work with any musician, who would you want to work with?
I guess if I could jam with Jimmy Page, that would be like a lifetime dream come true. I did get to meet him briefly once outside of a Grammy party. I was just hanging out front with this music manager, and I was about to go in and he said, "Oh, you should stay here. You're about to meet God." And I said, "Who's God?" And he said, "Who do you think?" And I said, "Jimmy Page." And he said, "Right." And then 5 seconds later, up walks Jimmy Page. It was insane. And,
wow.
He was sort of one of in the later years where he was beginning to look more like Yoko Ono. I think he had some plastic surgery and his hair was gray and it just looked weird, but it was him and it was incredible. And hopefully he never watches this, because that would absolutely extinguish any chance I ever had.
Just watch the first part, Jimmy. Don't watch the second part.
If Jimmy Page is watching this, bad for you, good for us. But that's all I'm saying. Those ratings are going up.
Years ago, when I was struggling playing clubs in Los Angeles with a band, we were playing at this place on the Sunset Strip called the Roxy. And we're loading out our equipment at the end. And suddenly this limo pulls up. Jimmy Page walks out and walks into the Rainbow where all the rock bands hung out. And I never really hung out at the Rainbow, but I'm like, I'm going into the Rainbow. And I brought my flyer for the next show to give to Jimmy. And so he's sitting at this table with his friends or whoever they were. And there's this big guard standing in front of the table. And I walk up and the guard says, "Keep moving." And I said, "Oh, I just want to invite Jimmy to the show." And he grabs me by the shirt and lifts me off the ground and says, "Keep moving." And so I just threw the flyer over his head and it landed on the booth next to Jimmy's leg. And he was just talking and it didn't look like he even noticed that it came in, but I did land next to him. And so I put him on the guest list for the next show just in case.
Nice.
But
there
he
you go.
didn't show up.
Yeah. It's safer that way. I get it.
Yeah.
As if he would need to be on the guest list, but
Yeah.
It's a nice look either way.
Well, Daniel, do you have a website, some social media? Do you have some upcoming projects that you'd like to talk about as we start to wrap things up?
Sure. I'm not great at the social media thing. Yeah, you can find me on Facebook. But the thing that I've been working on most recently that I've been most excited about is this band called the Halloween Jack. It's got Gilby Clarke from Guns N' Roses. It's got Steve Perkins from Jane's Addiction. It's me. It's Eric Dover, who is in Slash's Snake Pit and Jellyfish. And we're doing these 70s glam rock cover tunes. And it's been incredibly fun. We put out a video of the New York Dolls, Trash, with Steve Stevens from Billy Idol's band playing guitar. If you go to YouTube and you look up the Halloween Jack Trash, you can check out that video. We also did a cover of Search and Destroy, Iggy and the Stooges. If you go to YouTube and put in the Halloween Jack Search and Destroy, you can check that out. And then for this charity thing, we did Elton John, Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting. Same thing, the Halloween Jack, YouTube, Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting. You can check that out.
Awesome. Cool. Daniel, it's been a blast. Thank you so very much for spending a few moments of your time to sit down and chat with us here this evening. It was awesome.
All right. Well, reach out anytime. I had a good time, and take care.
All right. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us here on our conversation with Daniel Shulman.
And that's our show, everybody. Thanks for listening. I am Mick Manhattan, the Scene Snob. We always appreciate you guys tuning in and commenting along and everything else. Go check out this show or any of our other shows on thescenesnobs.com. Thescenesnobs.com. We love you. You guys are awesome. And if you would like, follow and subscribe to our social media. That really helps us go a long way. And please spread the word. Tell your friends. Have them come in. We love feedback and everything else. So everybody, you have a great day. Again, thanks for listening. Thescenesnobs.com. Take care, and I'll talk to you